Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. Today, I want to talk about The Rhythm Section, a Memphis music podcast. This is something that I created along with my co-host, Jeff Ward. He's a drummer, I'm a bass player, at least we try to be. Therefore, Rhythm Section. This is something that I want to give the origin story for because it will be talked about a lot when I start getting more and more current with these videos. It's a huge part of my life. It's changed my life. This story here is more than just how I started a podcast. This is not a tutorial on how to start a podcast. It's really a story about someone's life changing because of creating something in ways that I never imagined. It has connected me to the Memphis community in a big way. I've made some amazing friends. Hey, yo. Are you guys fans of Whitesnake by chance? Also, this ties in with my mom and how, since moving down here to Hernando, Mississippi, how our friend group has overlapped. Even some of you that might be watching this right now know me because of my mom here in the Memphis area, vice versa. Again, just want to catch everybody up because this story here and this podcast I'm fixing to talk about is a big part of my life. That is something that will be discussed more and more and more, which eventually will tie in with going back to talking about my studio and some of the current struggles it's going through. All right. The Rhythm Section, a Memphis music podcast. The podcast was designed to spotlight the amazing music community in Memphis and greater Memphis into North Mississippi, preferably DeSoto County, which is where I live in Hernando. And it is an interview style podcast. And I just kind of, when I started, just took the idea from what I do for the Real Hernando interview style podcast. I spotlight local nonprofits and organizations. So with that in mind, I basically copied the template and wanted to do that for our local music scene. The format has changed over time. Again, I'm not going to bury anyone in the details of the formatting of the show. But the way it started is fun. And what it's done since starting it is amazing. So as you heard in my last video about the story of my studio, I signed a lease in the summer of 2022. And as I'm building it, literally just putting together my desk, I start thinking about this idea that I've always had, that I've always wanted to do, and that is to start a podcast for musicians. And knowing that it was just something I wanted to do that was like the Real Hernando, only for musicians. But I never had the studio to do it in. The Real Hernando started without a studio because I just took one camera and some wireless clip mics and went to interview the person at their location, whether it's their store, their office, what have you. But I knew that wasn't going to work with the idea I had in my mind as far as a music podcast is concerned. Well, now I have a studio. So quickly after signing that lease, I want to say the first day I'm in there, I'm like, I'm going to be able to do this music podcast at some point. Fast forward a couple months, I would say late fall of 2022, I call my buddy Jeff Ward up. I'm like, Jeff, I need to tune my studio. I haven't recorded anything in it yet today or at all. And I finally have a little recording station set up with some cheapy cameras. Basically just whatever I had was set up and ready to film something. In order to get things moving, I have to use the toys. That's what I consider tuning the studio, at least in podcast world. Record content, play it back, look at it, and now start adjusting and making upgrades as you go. So I called Jeff up. Are you free Saturday? Yes. I'm like, come on up to the studio and I'm going to stick you in front of a microphone and we're just going to hang out like buddies and just talk. He's like, I'm all in. So that day comes. And I'm going to throw up a picture of the thumbnail from that very first video that I did in the studio. That's me and Jeff on the left. And it's not only the first time he and I record together, it's the first time anything is recorded in the studio, period. And we have fun. We have a great time, and we just talk nonsense. And I knew that it was just something I was going to throw on the channel. After we're done, I just throw it out there I just tell Jeff about this idea I have about the music-based podcast. I don't have a name for it yet, just an idea. And of course, Jeff is like, can I be on it? I'm like, of course, Jeff. You'll be the first guest. Don't worry. But he's like, man, that sounds like a really cool idea. I'd love to be on it someday. I'm like, absolutely, sir. So then he leaves. But now my wheels are turning in a big way, because I think just because I said it out loud to him, and it became more realistic to me because I'm sitting in a studio. I already knew that I had what I needed to get this thing going. But saying it out loud to Jeff just got the gears turning. And for the next few hours, I'm really thinking about how I want to do this. And it dawned on me that I could do this with Jeff. We had such a good time recording that video we did. It was so easy. He wasn't nervous about cameras and microphones. It was just like me and Jeff hanging out like we always do. And I'm like, I think it'd be cool to have Jeff as a co-host, something I'd never done before. Okay, what would we call it? And then I'm like, well, if Jeff's my co-host, he's a drummer, I'm a bass player, the rhythm section. For those that don't know, typically in any kind of rock band or country band or just your standard band, when someone refers to the rhythm section of said band, it's drums and bass. That's the typical lingo of what you call the rhythm section for your band. It's your drummer and your bass player, because they're so locked in with each other, and they're the foundation of everything else that's layered on top of it: guitars, keys, vocals, horns, whatever, what have you. But a good rhythm section is when you have a solid drummer and bass player locking in with each other and creating a good foundation. So I thought it was tongue-in-cheek. I thought it was silly, the Rhythm Section podcast. So I called Jeff up, tell him, man, I'm doing this. I want you as my co-host, and I'm calling it the Rhythm Section Podcast. What do you think? And he's like, I'm all in. I'm like, awesome. Come back next Saturday. We're going to record our first episode. He's like, all right. We didn't have anything booked. We had no interview booked, so I know that it's just going to be me and Jeff again. And I don't have a logo set for this thing yet. We don't have a Facebook page. All it has is my main channel that it's on now, that y'all used to follow when I did these vlogs there. I just wanted to get started. He rolls in that day, and I'm formatted the episode and kind of put together our talking points and some scripts. And this is so early on. A lot has changed since then as far as the quality of production. I tweaked lighting and the camera angles and got different cameras. And I already knew the quality was going to be above that very first video that me and Jeff did. But in typical fashion, well, most of you do not know my good friend Jeff Ward, but he is a very rambunctious person. And he comes into the studio, is like, I already booked an interview. Okay, with who? Tim Dills. Who's Tim Dills? And that is when the magic started, because Jeff, being Jeff, was fearless to email and call or text anybody. And what didn't dawn on me was the fact that Jeff grew up here, and he knows the scene from back in the 80s and 90s. And he reaches out to this gentleman by the name of Tim Dills, who I'd never heard of, but is a very well-known artist in Memphis that currently plays in a band called Fever Tree, but has a ton of history with all kinds of musicians in town. So without Jeff, I would have not known to book this guy. I'm like, wonderful. So we had an interview ready to go. But it took some time to get to the film session of that interview and then get it edited. So when you go back in the archives of the Rhythm Section podcast, the first 3 episodes are just me and Jeff. And that's because we were building up interviews and figuring this thing out, off and running. And me and Jeff are just trying to figure out how to interview together and become a rhythm section, if you will. Now we already know how to play with each other well in bands, but now there's a whole new dynamic. And I could not have asked for a better co-host, because Jeff comes in eager, is excited. He's always coming on time. Like he never acts like he doesn't want to be there. He's all in on it. And then he becomes my genius guest booker. I quickly see that he just knows people that I don't know, but everybody else does, which becomes the heart of this podcast, because as I'm learning quickly at this point, Memphis is very connected. It is a big, small town, or a small, big town. One of those two. The community's tight and a lot of history here. And I mean, they've all been here since the 80s. So you meet these musicians that they just know everybody else, and they can tell these stories back when they played with each other 30 years ago. It blew my mind. It opened my mind and eyes and heart to Memphis like I never thought it would in terms of the music community. I should note that at this point in my life, I'm not going out. I don't drink anymore. And at that time, I just didn't go out. I didn't go see bands. I was kind of a hermit. My life was business and my daughter. That was it. Just was in my own little bubble. But because of Jeff bringing these people into this studio of mine, my mind was blown. Meeting these amazing people, but just learning about how tied in everyone is and the history of this city, and how back in the hair band days in the mid to later 80s, there was a scene here that bubbled into the early 90s, and record labels were coming here to sign bands. Now that's a whole other story, because when Nirvana and Pearl Jam hit the scene and the grunge era began, unfortunately a big part of the story around here is bands that either got a record deal but then got cut because of the new music coming into the scene, or were on the bubble of getting one. That's one of the main themes that happened in Memphis. That the timing of the community was such where, man, it was on the cusp of big time, but the music industry changed. Regardless of that, it's just been crazy meeting these musicians, and more often than not, I'm meeting them as they enter my studio. Hello, nice to meet you, Jimmy Fulp. Hey, yo. And 5 minutes later, I'm interviewing this person. Meanwhile, Jeff has known Jimmy for a while, and even if Jeff doesn't know someone directly, he knows someone that can connect to that person. But he's been following this person for years and just knows that person's history in town, the different bands she has played in. And then Jeff and I, early on, said we need to get out. It's time to get out and go see some bands and be more social and shake some hands and network, introduce ourselves as a way to grow the podcast. And just, if this is what we're going to do, if we're going to have a podcast for our local music scene, then we need to be a part of it. So we do. And bam, a whole other world opens up to me, because I'm finally going out and seeing all these amazing cover bands, and I'm like, wow, the talent here is next level. It really is. And what's blowing my mind also is people are coming to us, hey, we love your show. And we're like, someone's actually watching this thing or listening to this thing. And certain musicians are happy and telling us they love the show. So, I mean, it immediately started clicking. Me and Jeff made a point pretty much every weekend to go out to see a band or two, knowing that then we would come to the show and talk about it and make it full circle. We go out, we shake hands, we meet some new musicians, say hello, take some pictures, So now they got to meet us, we get to meet them, or most didn't know who we are. I'm not saying everyone automatically knew what the show was, but now they did after meeting us. So then they turned on to the show. So it grew organically that way, but also knowing that me and Jeff were going to go talk about the bands and take some pictures and put pictures in the videos and just try to be a part of the community in this unique way. And then I started making killer friends because of it. And I have so many friends now that I would have never met before this. So now, where this really changes my life is when you bring Mama D into the picture. Now, she's part of the story because after me and Jeff start going out, my mom, at this point, had only gone out to see one band while living down here, and it was mine, or the band I was in at the time. Now I'm starting to play with a guy named Derek Joseph, along with Jeff, being the drummer. I think it was a New Year's Eve show, New Year's Eve 2022. And as you know, her mom had, by this time, had passed, and I know all of you follow my mom, so you know the story there. So my mom is now just kind of hanging out and kind of going through a rough time. So I invite her out. I'm like, Mom, you got to check out this band, Area 51. They're playing at a place called Dan McGinnis. Me and Jeff are going to do some networking. Come on out. I think you'll love them. Oh, she loved them all right. And so began Mama Darlene in Memphis, Tennessee. For the first time in decades, she found herself dancing on a dance floor. And when I was younger, she used to go out. That's what she loved doing, that stuff. She was partying then. She doesn't party now, but it just opened the world up for her. And she fell in love with the band and fell in love with this whole new world to her. And in typical obsessive fashion, she all of a sudden now is going out every weekend. She starts going to all the major places: Dan McGinnis, Hadley's, Neil's, Lafayette's, all these different, well-known bars that have great cover bands. And before I know it, we're in the same circle of people. Okay? You hear what I'm saying here? My mom and I now have the same friends. We're in the same circle. This is so foreign to me. Prior to her moving down here, we were 1,000 miles apart for 16 plus years. And she moves down here, and I did some old videos on this because when they first moved here, her and my grandmother lived with me, and it's been an ongoing process to get used to that, just to adjust and adapt to now having my mom next door to me. She literally lives in this apartment complex, 4-minute walk from here, if that. But now I'm going out to see a band with Mom, and all the musicians are getting to know my mom, and they, to the point where they know the songs she likes, and she becomes a character because she's such an avid dancer. She's just, you all know my mom. I don't have to explain to you who Mama Darlene is because you watch her channel. But imagine her in action out in the wild, and I have to be there witnessing it and sitting at the same table with my mom. And it was bizarre because I had no life prior to this podcast. Like I said, I was a hermit. I wasn't going out doing nothing. So was my mom. Same situation for her because of being a caretaker for her mom. And then simultaneously, together, we just start going out, and boom, it just opens up to where my mom is a social butterfly, and she knows more musicians than I do because she goes to see way more bands than I do. And it's become very cool. Interesting at first, something I had to get used to, but now I love it. I love going out and sitting with my mom, and all my friends know her now, so it's just like I can be at a table full of friends, all these friends, with the exception of Jeff and his wife. I could be at a table with 30 fucking people, and I only know them because of the podcast. And now my mom is friends with all these people too. And it's because of, in a roundabout way, because of the podcast. The podcast made me go out, which then made me invite my mom to come out, and boom. And there you go. And lives changed. I can speak for my mom. Her life has completely changed. Mine has changed. Our life together has changed. We've never had a relationship like this before. And my mom will tell you straight up, before me moving to Nashville in '05, we didn't hang out at all. And my childhood was what it was. And my mom's been vocal about all that as well. So all these years later, in my 40s, and my mom's early 60s, we're actually building a relationship, which is fun. We both don't drink, so it's sort of a clean rebirth of our relationship because of the Rhythm Section and Memphis Music Podcast. It's been crazy. It's been fun. It's also been stressful. The podcast is a lot of work. When I first started it, I really leaned on my team because at the time my business was doing a little better. But we're going to get into all that next episode. But it's a very expensive podcast if I'm to use my team. I've had to adapt over time where now I do all the editing, all the work. So instead of spending a lot of money, I'm spending a ton of time. I put in about 15 hours a week on the podcast, and which yields one episode a week. But again, this isn't a tutorial. I'm not going to bury anybody in the details with that, but it's what I love most in terms of what I make. I always thought that being a bass player was the best I had to offer. The level at which I play is for someone else to decide. Same with podcasting. I'm not saying I'm not rating myself as a producer against anyone else, but it's the best thing I do. For years I thought it was bass, but now this podcast world, even before this podcast, became my thing, that I do best. That the best thing I have to offer to society as far as creating anything, it's become my art. But the Rhythm Section podcast specifically is the best thing I've ever created. And it's all of me goes into it. If there's any kind of character or any kind of vibe to the show, it's genuine. It's me. The person you see on the show, that's me. And all the mistakes and the blemishes and the mumbling and the poor reading of scripts, but also some of my sense of humor goes in there when I'm getting more and more, I'm getting stronger with putting up cool photos and images, and I have sound bites that I use that represent different kinds of jokes and self-deprecation. When I space out, I have a button I hit that yells squirrel because I just squirreled. So I'm making fun of myself, but those are the things that I came up with because I'm a goofball, really, at heart. So all of me goes into this show, and I give all of myself to it. Outside of family and loved ones, it's the only thing I love. I don't love playing music anymore. I mean, if I was ever to be in the right thing, maybe, and I do enjoy it, but I don't have the passion for that like I do now for this podcast. Anyway, so there you go. You're going to hear about this podcast a lot, just because it's a massive part of my life, and I hope to keep it going, but to be continued, because we're finally getting to the place where I can start talking about some of the changes and decisions I've had to make with my business, which will eventually tie into this podcast and my band work and music and all kinds of crazy stuff, and decisions have been made over the last couple of weeks that I'm trying to race to, so this can be more of a current vlog. But as I always say, I'm always going to tell stories on this thing. That's what this is for. So It's still bizarre to me that any of you care about this. I appreciate you watching and enjoying this content. I certainly am having more fun doing these videos again. But for the sake of length of video, I'm going to say bye. Hope you all have a great day, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.